I've wanted to write this book since I was in my 20s. When I was in graduate school, um, the subject of race making, we had reached a point by the time I was in grad school in the 1990s where we, by which I mean academia, recognized that race is not biologically real, right? That nature doesn't divide human beings into the racial categories that we're familiar with, that it's a human construction for human purposes. And yet, almost all of the scholarship on the subject as pertaining to the United States treated this history of race making as a white black issue. And the public did too. And as someone specializing in Native American history, I found that dynamic quite curious. Um, Reason being that Native people were most of the people in North America during the 17th and the 18th centuries. They controlled most of the continent well into the 19th century. And they have held a special status by virtue of being indigenous in this country right up to this present day. Um, so it seemed to me that they were a fundamental factor in that history of race making. Um, as I was coming along in the profession, increasing numbers of case studies started to emerge about the way that white Indian wars over the course of the colonial and early national periods produced virulent race hatred between the two parties. And as I kept reading more and more of these case studies, I started to think to myself, boy, someone needs to pull this big story together. And then I realized it's much bigger than just the wars. That Native people have been fundamental to the history of race making, including the emergence of white identity among Europeans throughout the entire course of American history. I decided it was time to write this book. And the other factor here was teaching. There's a real synergy between historical scholarship and historical teaching. As one teaches, you go to the extant scholarship and you say, okay, what is the base of knowledge on this subject, and then you find holes in it, or students ask questions and you can't answer them. And you say, hey, this is a research opportunity. This is an opportunity to tell a story that no one has ever told before. And that was an important factor in this book too. Very often characterize white expansion as an invasion, and it certainly became that. No question about it. But it didn't begin that way. And that transition is really important in understanding the history of race. So when Europeans arrive in North America, more often than not, the native people where the Europeans settled welcomed the settlement because they wanted the trade with Europeans. And, native people didn't have metal. And, these Europeans have all of these goods made of this incredible substance, knives and kettles and hatchets, guns, never mind cloth and beads and all kinds of other exquisite items. Native people wanted these materials to enrich their daily lives, but also for defense. They realized that if they had the weaponry of Europeans, they could better defend themselves and they could expand at the expense of their intertribal rivals. And when the Europeans secure those beachheads, Europeans come with this sense of moral purpose that I think, many of us dismiss because we understand that colonialism is going to become a conquest, but I don't think we should. The leaders of most colonial ventures said that their intent was to Christianize, civilize, and ultimately absorb Native people into European civilization. Um, and that they believed Native people were capable of making this transition, and that they would see of their own accord how desirable it was. The Of course, this is a utopian scheme, right? And when Europeans meet Native resistance to that scheme, which also includes taking Native land, then racial racial hatreds begin to bubble up. And that's a big part of the book. The terms that Europeans use towards Native people is they call them savages, barbarians, and heathens. And you're getting into racial territory when those terms begin to take on permanent meaning. So those terms suggest that a people's culture, not their bodies, but that their cultures are inferior. And most European thinkers imagine that native people who they deemed savage or barbarian or heathen could change, that they could become Christian and civilized. Eventually, though, as Europeans are meeting resistance from native people, they begin to contend that these people are indelible savages, that they're indelible barbarians, that they will always be heathens, that it's not worth trying to Christianize and civilize them. At the same time, native people have their own terms for Europeans. They did not call them white people when the colonial period starts. They call them iron men, cloth men, hat men, things of that nature in reference to their remarkable material culture. Let me lay out 4 categories of people who come up repeatedly in this centuries-long story that I'm telling. Among the Europeans, you have missionaries and you have populist demagogues. So missionaries are very often on the front lines of relations with Native people. They sometimes they live with Native people. They learn their languages. They know them by name. They sleep over one another's houses. Yeah, and it's with the purpose of transforming Native people, to be sure. But nevertheless, these relationships are close. They're intimate. And they're quite real. And these missionaries document their relations with Native people quite extensively. And these relations include very deep conversations about the nature of human beings, about what colonialism is all about what living the right way is all about. And you can capture not only Europeans' views about human similarity and difference in these conversations, but Native ones too. On the other hand, you have populist demagogues. And throughout colonial and American history, every once in a while, you get these figures who rise up and whip up the racial passions of the white masses and say, we need to wipe all these Native people out, be they Christian or not, allies or not, hostile or not, that we cannot live safely with any of these people within range of our settlements. And it happens repeatedly all the way into the late 19th century, starting in the 17th all the way into the 19th. On the Native side of things, you have 2 categories of people who come up repeatedly. One is prophets, religious prophets, who will respond to the emergencies that Native people are experiencing under white pressure, to say, we Indians, a term they borrow from the Europeans, need to band together across tribal lines and do the bidding of the Great Spirit, who wants us to purge ourselves of colonial influences and push white expansion back. And then you have chiefs, right, who very often are inspired by these prophets, trying to translate those religious visions into political movements. My students find it fascinating and more than a little cute, because I'm so old-fashioned in my approach. I take notes on Microsoft Word, extensive notes on any given source that I'm reading at a time. and then I break down those notes into individual note cards. 1 point to a note card. And so I have thousands and thousands of note cards that make up a book. And I put them in order and I categorize them. I effectively outline by putting the cards in order, and then I write by going through the cards, weaving information together into narrative form. I find it to be much more effective than the kind of electronic note taking that has kind of dominated the lives of historians in recent decades. Let's be clear, a lot of it is dark and grim, but it's not all dark and grim, and I think that's a really important point to accent here. So the first point, and let me be clear, when I started this research, this is not where I thought I was going to end up. But what I concluded is that the history of race making, as it applies to Native people, unfolded in the context of what I'm characterizing as a structural genocide over the course of 4 centuries. And here's what I mean by that. What I mean is the identities, Indian and white especially, developed relationally, in relation to one another, in the context of the forces Europeans unleashed, simply devastating Native America and producing a catastrophic population loss. And what I contend is that not only did these identities emerge in the context of that disaster, but that they contributed to that disaster. That white peoples, as Europeans came to define themselves, white people's devaluation of Native people, their treatment of them as inferior and disposable and fated to disappearance, made white people more likely to treat Native people in that way. And that the entire culture has contributed to that devaluation of Native life right up until very recent times. But here's the more uplifting story that you were talking about. There has been a significant change in this country since the 1960s. Up until the 1960s, the overwhelming majority of white Americans said that Native people were fated to extinction. Since the late 1960s, a sizable portion of the white public, and most importantly, the federal government, there's been a bipartisan consensus on this matter, has concluded that Native people are a permanent part of the United States, that their tribes should exercise the maximum amount of sovereignty permitted within our constitutional order, and that they should lead fulfilling, vibrant, rewarding lives. That is a sea change from 3.5 centuries of American history. Now, let's be clear. Not all white Americans think this way. There are a portion of white Americans who are quite hostile to Native people's rights. But nevertheless, Democrats and Republicans alike have operated around a bipartisan consensus since Richard Nixon around this notion that Native people are permanent, co-equal parts of the United States. And that gives me hope for the future.